roughly the past year and a half, I've been cataloging Famicom games, one a day. And as of episode 478, I have reached April 21st, 1989. The day that Nintendo launched their third hardware platform. The first platform was the Famicom, the system that I've decided to spend 3 years of my life covering. The second platform was the Famicom Disk System. And as an expansion of the Famicom hardware, there was a lot of overlap with what I was already doing, so I decided not to drill down into it. But the Game Boy is something different. It's a whole new platform, but it's still an echo of the Famicom. It's an 8-bit system at a time when the rest of the world was going to 16-bit. Not to mention how the portability of the system lent itself to different styles of games. I couldn't let the launch of the Game Boy pass without some kind of comment. Now, I'm not going to start covering two systems simultaneously. One is hard enough, and scope creep just means I'll never finish. This video's just a one-off for the Game Boy launch. With this video, I'm looking at three things. First, what's Nintendo up to? In 1989, they're publishing a single Famicom game, and 1990 isn't much better. So we're going to be looking at all of the games Nintendo published on the Game Boy for that first year. Second, as the Famicom fades in prominence in the 90s, the Game Boy becomes the standard bearer for 8-bit video games. And while we can't make one-to-one comparisons, there are some direct ports to the Game Boy of titles we've seen on the Famicom. So we're going to look at all of those for the first year of the Game Boy's life. Third, the Game Boy sets the precedent that mobile gaming platforms get the downgraded version of the Big Boy franchise from the real console. And a lot of publishers make spin-off games from their series onto the Game Boy. In particular, a lot of these Game Boy releases are timed to be simultaneous with releases for other platforms. So we're going to compare the on-the-go experiences to the at-home gaming. Across those three categories, that's over 50 games I'm going to be covering, so I'm definitely not getting in-depth on any of these. As I go through my list, I'm playing the games on original, unmodified hardware. Okay, not an original Game Boy, since that'd be a pain to capture from. I'm using a Super Game Boy for that. All of the games are being played from an original cartridge, though in the case of the Game Boy games, some of them are the US versions rather than the Japanese versions. It's just what I had on hand for a spur-of-the-moment video. I'm going to be taking these chronologically, so we're starting out on April 21st, 1989, when the Game Boy launched with 4 titles, all published by Nintendo. And I'm going to start with the one that's something completely new. Kind of. Alleyway is Nintendo's version of Breakout. The classic action game where you just have to keep the ball up in the air and smashing bricks. The game has you repeat the same patterns multiple times. First it just sits there while you hit it, then it rotates through the screen, then it slowly comes down towards you with the bottom bricks vanishing as they get close. Nintendo decided to squeeze Mario into this one by having him jump into the paddle before the game starts, and making the bonus stages Mario-shaped. Curiously, the ball doesn't bounce on the bonus stages, it just plows through the bricks. You know how in every set of launch games, there's the game that's clearly intended as the system seller that'll make people rush out and get it? And then there's a few games that are clearly tech demos that people were trying out, and then got expanded to be full games so that they'd fill out that release schedule? Yeah, Alleyway is that second one. It's fine, but without any power-ups or interesting board layouts, it just feels very generic. There are 3 games that are directly responsible for the Famicom's success in its first year. Nintendo is going to directly port the other 2, but Mahjong was originally a game by Hudson Soft, and so Nintendo had to make their own Mahjong game. Not that you can really tell a bit of difference between the two. This is a 2-player variant of Mahjong, and to keep that explanation short, Mahjong is a set-building game, and in the Japanese version, you have to build particular special hands. The rarest of those hands, and the most valuable of them in terms of scoring, are Yakuman, which is where this game gets its title from. This is about as bare bones of Mahjong game as you can make, and it doesn't even play especially well. It takes a long time to refresh your hand when you discard a tile, for example. And by 1989, this wasn't your only option for playing Mahjong on the go. LCD handhelds that would play Mahjong had been around a while. Yakuman feels obligatory. Mahjong was one of Nintendo's biggest hits, therefore they needed a Mahjong game at the Game Boy's launch. Here it is, it's functional, and you really can't say much more about it than that. Baseball is another of the games that carried the Famicom through its early years. It was another monster hit for Nintendo, and it was the only baseball game on the Famicom for 3 years until Namco released Family Stadium. It wouldn't be long after that before everyone had their own yearly baseball franchise on the system. So this baseball is coming into a world that is completely saturated with baseball games. Of course, there's a real advantage to being the first mover, and so Game Boy Baseball was a hit as well. But it comes up really short in comparison to other baseball games at the time. It's slow, choppy, there's really only 4 teams, the 2 that face each other down in the USA League, and the 2 that face each other down in the Japan League. I guess this counts as a game that has a Mario appearance, since Mario and Luigi are playing on the baseball teams. Though you can't really tell it's them. Something that this game picked up from more recent baseball games are stats for the players. Though since it's really your skill that determines success or failure, it's hard to tell how those stats actually affect things. It won't take long before the other publishers start moving their baseball franchises over to the Game Boy as well. In fact, I'll have one of those later on in this video. So I think the shine comes off Game Boy Baseball much more quickly than it did for the original. At last we've come to our final Game Boy launch title. The one that people actually remember, Super Mario Land. A beloved classic that I am now about to completely dump on. I can already see the comments telling me, but it was good for what it was, and the response to that is, good for what it was is not the same thing as good. Super Mario Land gets one thing correct. The movement mechanics feel right. Everything else, however, is more like one of the bad Super Mario Bros. Knockoffs the Famicom has, than Super Mario Bros. Scaled down to a handheld. Take how you interact with bricks, for example. I'm pretty sure that there's a bug that has their hitboxes a few pixels to the left of their actual appearance on screen. You've got a bad tendency to pass right through them. Then there's the power-up placement. Later stages like to throw them into pits and make you jump for them. The levels are long, but they repeat the same terrain over and over again. And there's things like this section where you're supposed to ride on a boulder, but sometimes the boulder just doesn't appear. And why are some of the stages shoot-em-ups? Rather than a fireball, you've got this bouncing ball that can collect coins, but some of the enemies take multiple hits, and you can only have one ball out at a time. So if you miss, they could probably hit you. And the game is very generous with the extra lives, both through the sheer quantity of coins in the game, and the availability of end-of-stage bonuses if you exit through the top door. The very first time I played Super Mario Land back in the day, I beat the game. And I don't mean the first sitting, I mean my first game. Having a portable Super Mario Bros. Game at launch definitely boosted the Game Boy, but it's not a good Super Mario Bros. Game. The annoying thing is, I really do think this could have been good. The mechanics are all there, except for that flower. It's mainly let down by the level design and programming. We're past the launch titles, but Nintendo is still reviving the games from the earliest days of the Famicom. The Famicom Tennis is a better game than you'd expect from early 1984, and the Game Boy version is a bit of a standout among the early games for the system. The court is scaled down from the Famicom version, and they've loosened up the timing to connect with the racket. But this is still a pretty good tennis game. This is about as simple and straightforward of game as you can get, but it works because it's just tennis. And hey, Mario's still there. This one also had link cable support, and if you used it, both players got to see the court from their player's perspective. Of all the direct ports from the Famicom to the Game Boy, Tennis is one of the best. So here we have one of the two games most associated with the Game Boy, and since the other one was one of the very last Game Boy releases, we won't be seeing any pocket monsters around here. Tetris is a bit of an odd situation, since it's not a port of the Famicom version, it's another port of the computer game. But it's a second port of the computer game done by the same people who made the port for the Famicom, but not published by that same company, because that company made a deal with Nintendo to secure the rights to Tetris. And so Nintendo published this, even though Bulletproof Software developed it. And Bulletproof Software's first attempt to port Tetris was awful. The controls were set up identically to the computer version, which was built around having a joystick and one button. Someone at Nintendo clearly went, "Hey, why don't you make the interface, good?" And that would be why this version of Tetris sold 35 million copies. One thing I have to note about this version on the Game Boy, the very first printing of this one in Japan featured different music. That's given them some extra value in the eyes of collectors. This is some proper Tetris action, although it does change a few key things. There's no hard drop, and you can rotate both clockwise and counterclockwise now. The simple visual style and pick up and put down gameplay really lent itself to the portability of the Game Boy. You could turn it on, pick out your difficulty level, and play out a round of Tetris in those 5 minutes you have waiting. It's really a model of what mobile gaming would become. I hope you're ready for the most visually exciting game in this video. But it does make an interesting counterpoint to Tetris. The Famicom version of Shanghai was by Sunsoft, but it was a port of an Activision computer game. So for the Game Boy port, it was developed and published by HAL Labs. But that's not the end of the story. The Game Boy version proved to be very popular, and so it stayed in print throughout the Game Boy's lifetime. Eventually, Activision just bought it outright from HAL, and they continued to publish it even in Japan. My version has a 1996 copyright date on it, and all of the places on the box that said HAL now say Activision. It's still the same game though. And the Game Boy version is much better than the Famicom version. Probably because it was done by HAL rather than Sunsoft. This was one of the last games published by Sunsoft before they started showing some technical skill. The only problem I have with the Game Boy version is that some of the tiles are difficult to read, but there is an alternative tile set that changes it from standard Mahjong tiles to just symbols and letters. As for the gameplay itself, it does exactly what it's supposed to. Match tiles on the outside of the pile in order to remove them, and work your way down. And it's another puzzle game perfect for the portable format. And it definitely helps that HAL recognized how things had to be scaled for the Game Boy screen. Shanghai isn't going to excite anybody, especially since it's on literally every single platform, but I think in 1989 people were pretty pleased with this release. And now for something a bit different. Konami's Championship Motocross was published early in 1989, and here is a sequel on the Game Boy. Alright, they look different, but they share a lot of the same core mechanics. The challenge in each of these is keeping the bike upright as you land on ramps. Motocross Maniacs just changed out the realistic track for this side view and crazy loops. They also added collectible power-ups and a turbo boost for your bike. That boost is actually the key mechanic to Motocross Maniacs, since you won't be able to get across certain jumps unless you use it. I actually find Motocross Maniacs a bit tough to play due to how you don't really land on surfaces cleanly, and how you can just get trapped if you don't have a boost. You're also racing against a timer rather than other bikes. I feel like they were trying to make something that was a platformer with a motocross bike, but the controls make it tough to do any kind of precision jumping. Maybe if I practiced the controls, I'd like this one better. Konami will actually release 2 sequels to this on later Game Boy platforms. The The Famicom version of Loadrunner shares the title of the first third-party Famicom game. The Game Boy version might be early, but not that early. And this is a situation where history has split the game series, resulting in something very different on the Game Boy. The Famicom version was by Hudson and was a direct port of the original computer game. However, when the game turned out to be a hit in Japan, IREM licensed it to make an arcade game. Hudson eventually lost the console license, and IREM picked it up to make their own port for the Famicom Disk System. Which brings me to Hyper Loadrunner, IREM's unique Loadrunner game for the Game Boy. Loadrunner is the classic puzzle action game where you have to collect all the gold bars on a level, then exit off the top of the screen, and you can drill holes to your left or right that will fill in over time and trap the robots chasing you. Rather than being a straight port of the original Loadrunner, a lot of the levels in Hyper Loadrunner are new, and nasty. Right off the bat, they're requiring that you carefully drill down large paths, and do it very quickly before your exit gap shuts. You're immediately required to use advanced techniques in order to complete stages. You can skip around the first 15 stages, and then after that you'll need a password to continue. There's other problems with this port. Your tiny viewing area is a real issue, and the robot movements are a lot more prone to getting stuck. There is a 2-player mode based on IREM's Super Loadrunner, where you and a friend over a link cable can take on the stages together. This game isn't as cruel as Championship Loadrunner, the infamously super difficult sequel Hudson released, but it is getting up there. HAL Laboratory was responsible for a lot of the very early Famicom games from Nintendo, including Pinball. The team that worked on Pinball immediately went off and made another pinball game for computers called Rollerball. And then 5 years later, they ported it back to the Famicom. So this team had a fair amount of experience making pinball video games. Pinball Rokju Rok Hiki no Wani Daikoshin reflects that experience. I'm fairly particular when it comes to video pinball, so I have to say I'm not really fond of the physics model in the Game Boy game. The ball acts like it's made out of rubber, bouncing around constantly, always jiggling when it should just be rolling. That said, the table design is excellent. The primary table has 3 tiers, and the gateways to get back up are pretty reasonable. You have to shoot these open mouths on the bottom screen, and on the middle screen, you have to shoot these 3 drop targets on the left to open the gate. Basically, it's easier to get up from the bottom than it is to get all the way up to the top. There's also a secret bonus stage where you essentially are playing Breakout. There's plenty of good targets in this one, lots of extra bonuses, a way on every screen to trigger some kickbacks and blockers. This is not a loop, 3 bumpers and 3 rollovers kind of situation. If you see all of those right next to each other, that's how you know you're dealing with poor pinball table design. This isn't what I would call a top-tier game, but for 1989, this was pretty good. And pinball was definitely the kind of game that lent itself to short play sessions while you're on the go. One of the odd things about the chosen format for Famidaily is that we're currently in April of 1989, and I still haven't talked about Dracula. Akumajo Dracula and Dracula 2 were released on the Famicom Disk System, while Akumajo Densetsu won't be released until December. So chronologically, Dracula Densetsu was the first Dracula cartridge released in Japan. Unfortunately, this attempt to move the action series to a portable platform was disastrously awful. It's stiff, slow, the platforming doesn't work, and overall, not a lot of fun. There's 2 levels of whip upgrades. The first one makes the whip hit harder, while the second one gives you a fireball. Getting hit by anything drops your whip strength down a level. There's no sub-weapons in the Game Boy release, just the whip. The stages are enormous, but that just makes them more frustrating. There's also only 4 of them. That might have been okay given how long they are, but it also means you only have 4 bosses. This is a perfect example of bringing a game series to the Game Boy, but giving the players a far inferior experience. It's not the lack of colors and the sound that's the issue here. The actual game design choices are all wrong. This is the kind of thing that tends to give Game Boy titles a bad reputation. At least Dracula Densetsu would eventually get a remake that would improve things enormously. Here we have the other game that drove Famicom sales for the first couple years. And in this case, it's a bit of a lucky break for Nintendo. 1989 really marks the start of when people were playing just a ton of golf on their video game machines. We've had a few golf games so far on the Famicom, but 1990 and 1991 are the real peak of the golf boom. And here's Nintendo with a cartridge just titled Golf. Even if Nintendo's version of golf wasn't already wildly popular, the Game Boy version is in the right place at the right time. The Game Boy version reflects a lot of the improvements that we've seen to golf games in the past few years. While it still uses the swing meter and lacks any kind of helpful club selection, the Game Boy game gives you a closer look at the links, offers 2 courses, and much more complicated greens. Both of the courses on the cartridge are new as well. The portable version also saves your progress after every hole. So when you reach your station on your commute, you can turn it off and not lose anything. The height of your shot is also better modeled. So a low shot with a wood is more likely to run into a tree than a high shot with an iron. The original Famicom Golf was a groundbreaking title that everyone is still using principles from to this day. Game Boy Golf doesn't have that kind of reach. It's just following in the footsteps of other golf games at the time. Still, it is a very well done golf game, and one of the better Game Boy games in its first year of releases. What do you do when you want to gamble in Japan, but it's one of those rare instances where there isn't a pachinko parlor for nearly 3 blocks? Well, then it's time to break out your Game Boy and pachinko time. Of all of the instances of bringing a Famicom game over to the Game Boy, Pachinko Time may be the least surprising. Coconuts Japan, also known as Sea Dream, practically specialized in pachinko games, and they're the kind of thing that easily fits into the Game Boy, so bringing over their mascot Coon, the anthropomorphic pachinko ball, was a given. In fact, they're going to publish 9 pachinko games on the Game Boy. To give the 10-second overview, Pachinko is the gambling game where people launch silver balls up into a field of pegs, and then if it falls down a hole, more silver balls come out. The goal in Pachinko Time is to work your way through a kingdom of pachinko parlors, cleaning out machines at all of them. To clean out a machine, you need to have it spit out all 2,000 of its balls. So as you launch, you'll see your ball total on the left, and the number of balls remaining in the machine on the right. You hit left and right to adjust the power of your shot, and hold down A to launch balls. There's no power meter here, and you have to hold down right for quite a while to be able to launch it into the playfield. If you're really a pachinko addict, then Pachinko Time does have quite a few machines. And while Quest Mode is stripped down from other Pachinko games, it's still here. This might be just a pachinko game, but it seems to be a pretty solid one for such an early release. Alright, I'm stretching my rules a little bit for this one, but I think this one's important enough that it's worth stretching for. Makai Toshi Saga was the first Game Boy RPG. And it's not just any RPG, it is effectively a sequel to Final Fantasy II. One of the things that people remember the most about Final Fantasy II is that the gameplay mechanics were unusual. It was a system where the strength of your abilities was dependent upon your use of items, and the ways that you grew were not necessarily intuitive. Designer Akitoshi Kawazu took that concept and then went even further with Saga. I'm blocking myself out 2 minutes for each of these games, so I can't even scratch the surface of the mechanics here. There's 3 classes of characters, each with their own methods of progression, and none of them are as simple as get more experience points and build up levels. Even equipment management is not straightforward in Saga. What people can carry and use is a lot more restricted than it is in other games. Esoteric mechanics that are almost impenetrable to the player become a bit of a mainstay for the Saga series. And that really starts here. Now you might think that'd be the kind of thing that would put players off, but Saga was the best-selling Square game up to that point. The Final Fantasy games and Highway Star were getting Square some attention, but it was Makai Toshi's Saga that put them on the map. I overlooked this one while drawing up my initial list of Game Boy games to talk about, because a game titled Shogi just doesn't stand out. But while I was working on the video, I realized that this game was Pony Canyon using their existing Shogi engine on a portable platform. So while the Game Boy Shogi might not be part of the Tanigawa Koji series, it is built from the same structure. Shogi is the Japanese board game similar to chess, where each player has a set of pieces, each with their own way of moving, and the goal is to capture the other player's king. I know how to play Shogi, but I'm not very good at it, obviously. So I can't say very much about how well the game is playing, but I can tell you that the presentation is reasonable. Shogi pieces are defined by the symbol on them, so by removing the shape of the piece, they've made that symbol a lot more visible on the Game Boy's tiny screen. And it seems to play pretty well, although a little bit slow. This is the first Shogi game on the Game Boy, though not the first portable Shogi game, since LCD Shogi games had existed for a little while. And for some reason, it's going to take almost 5 years before someone makes another Shogi game on the Game Boy. Karateka is a good example of a boom-era Famicom release. They couldn't keep Famicom games on the shelf, so everyone was looking around for anything that they could publish. Karateka was a big smash hit on computers, so why not make a Famicom port? Now here we are 4 years later with a Game Boy port that adds a few things to it, but still manages to be much worse than the Famicom version. The concept of Karateka is that you're a karate master who is invading the mountaintop fortress of an evil warlord to rescue a princess. And in terms of gameplay, you just keep going to the right and attacking whoever comes at you. It was best known for the rotoscoped character animation. The Game Boy version is Master Karateka, and it adds a few new spins. First, you can put points into stats: power, health, and speed. Second, enemies will now attack you with long-ranged weapons that you'll have to hit. And third, it's possible to acquire and use items in your quest. But what you're really going to notice about Master Karateka is that it's slow. It looks like you're moving through molasses. You do these big steps and make no progress. It means that you can't get in close to the people you're fighting too. That makes the only effective attack your kick. Your punches will never reach them. The animations always made Karateka a slower game, but this is just about unplayable. Karateka is a very important game in the history of the medium, and this might just be the worst version of it. I take back every bad thing I said about Rokujuroku Hiki no Wani Daikoshin. That pinball game was a masterpiece compared to this. I'm not really sure how this train wreck happened. As the ball constantly phases through bumpers and the flippers, Hiro Shugo Pinball Parley clearly needed a lot more development time. But releasing a month after Jalico's Pinball Quest, and 2 weeks into the new year, means that they missed all of their critical dates by quite a margin. Once you can't tie it into your own release, or make those New Year's sales, you might as well take an extra month polishing it up. So besides the ball physics that could best be described as spooky action at a distance, the table design itself is terrible. The shots don't line up cleanly, you have to make weird angles for anything. And it's a perfect example of what I point to as lazy table design in video pinball. A loop lane, a few drop targets, and some bumpers. A few characters from Jalico games make an appearance here, but they're all so unmemorable that the only one I recognize is Buddha-san the pig, and that's because I recorded the Famidaily about his game yesterday. There is a second table here with some odder features, like a trigger that can make your flippers invisible. Though if your flippers are invisible, you won't know if you missed because you couldn't see your flippers, or because the ball passed right through them. I have played a lot of bad pinball video games over the years, and this one ranks down among the worst. Our second original Nintendo creation for the Game Boy is Solar Striker. And for a game that seems like it has a lot going on, this is actually one of the harder games to discuss. Solar Striker is a shoot 'em up in the style of very early games in that genre, like Star Force. You just have waves of enemies, and you have your ship. Technically, there are power-ups, but the power-ups just add an additional bullet shooting straight forward, and since anything that takes more than one hit to be destroyed is rare, adding firepower doesn't really give you a whole lot. That triple shot may look nice, but it's not really doing anything for you. The one feature that keeps Solar Striker from being an absolutely stripped to the bare bones shoot 'em up is that there are bosses, and the bosses are halfway decent. Nothing super impressive, but a lot more action than we've been seeing on the Game Boy so far. The rest of the shooting action is just okay. It's fine. It's acceptable for a shooting experience on the go in 1989. Not something I could see people going back to revisit, though. The weird thing about the Famicom version of Othello is that it was done by no one less than HAL Laboratory. It's a game that even the cheapest of contract developers could put out a reasonable version of, and they got one of the best developers for the Famicom to make it. The Game Boy Othello, on the other hand, was by Tsukuda Original, a developer who worked for Saga on early SG-1000 games, and hadn't developed a game in 6 years. I'm guessing they had some kind of relationship with Kawada, the publisher of this game and the publisher of the physical board game. Tsukuda Original will spend the 90s basically making Othello games. And the Game Boy Othello is a reasonable version of Othello. This is the board game sometimes known as Reversi, where players alternate putting down white and black pieces on the board, and surrounding an opponent's piece makes it flip over to your side. Othello is a pretty challenging game, mainly because the strategy is not too complicated for a computer. So even the Game Boy's Z80 processor can put up a good fight. And this is a good game for the Game Boy's format. It's easy to make out the pieces even with just 4 colors, and the games go fast enough that you could squeeze in a round during a 10-minute wait. It's a very bare bones package, but what are you expecting from Othello? What black sorcery did Konami perform to get parallax scrolling working on a Game Boy? Even if the seam here is pretty obvious, it's still amazing that they're doing it at all. Nemesis is the version of Gradius for the Game Boy, and the title's actually taken from what was used as the international title for the original Gradius arcade game. With the success of the 8-bit port under the Gradius name, the name Nemesis was freed up to use with other projects, and so it became the name for the Game Boy series. It's honestly amazing how close Nemesis comes to the Famicom port of Gradius. The view is more zoomed in, but the weapons are all there. You can have your 2 options. You even fight the big core at the end of the first stage. It also has the same problems that Gradius always did. You spend a lot of time powering up, and if you die, you may not be able to recover. Nemesis at least throws a ton of power-up capsules at you. It was starting to feel like every other enemy dropped one. Another nice feature is that at the beginning of the game, you can choose what stage you want to start at and how many lives you want to have. It's a concession to the portability of the game. While you'll want to play through the whole thing from beginning to end, if you only have a few minutes, you can jump right to your favorite stage. Nemesis also feels a lot easier than its big brothers. Given how tight the viewport is, I suspect that they scaled things back a bit for players. I think Nemesis is the most visually impressive game in the Game Boy's first year. The only things that even come close are other Konami games. And it's not just good looks, it plays great too. This is a real high point of these early days. There's just no way for a custom palette choice to save the look of this one. In Japan, officially, Baseball Kids is not part of the Moero Pro Yaku series. In the US, on the other hand, they literally just called it Bases Loaded. And despite what some websites seem to think, it is an original game, not a port of the NES Bases Loaded. Now that said, baseball was one of the big franchises for Jalico, so bringing that to the Game Boy was a really obvious choice for them. And I'm going to tell you something right now, I like the gameplay in Baseball Kids a lot more than I do in Moero Pro Yakyu. The best innovation is the pitching. You pick where you're aiming, and then you pick how you want to throw the ball. It's a lot better than the finicky control schemes that the regular Famicom baseball games have for pitching. Also, the field seems pretty small in the Game Boy game. And your fielders seem to be pretty quick. You can run your third baseman out to catch a pop fly. The big downsides here are that there's only 2 teams, and you can't see the stats of the pitchers when you're picking from them. But other than that, this one's actually a halfway decent baseball game. Better than what Nintendo was offering, at least. I love Flip Pole. It's an exciting cube game. There's a bit of an oddity to this Game Boy game. It started out as an arcade game, got a Famicom port, and then this Game Boy port. And the Game Boy port is the one that was released in the US. Now it might be hard to tell just from watching here, but the Game Boy version is a really good port of Flip Pole. Yeah, it's scaled down, but this is Flip Pole. All you really need is to tell the symbols on the cubes apart. And while it may be small on the Game Boy screen, it is very clear and visible. The concept of Flip Pole is that there's a stack of cubes, and your goal is to get them down below the clear number. You start out with a wildcard cube that becomes the same as whatever cube it first touches, and whenever a cube that you've launched touches a cube that it doesn't match, it replaces that cube in the stack and sends the cube that it collided with flying back to you. Cubes that match, on the other hand, are destroyed. So basically you have to manipulate the stack to clear it, and if you ever can't hit a matching cube, then you lose a life. Your shots go horizontal, and then get deflected downward. And that's literally every game mechanic that you need to know. Flip Pole is one of those games that's very simple to understand and play, but the stages quickly become more complicated and require more thought in order to clear that stack. It's one of my favorite puzzle games on the Famicom, and I've always been happy with the Game Boy port. So Tetris is the biggest thing since sliced bread. How are other game companies going to cash in on it? For Konami, they took the falling blocks of Tetris and had you shoot at them. Quarth is kind of a weird one because it was released to arcades about 6 months before this Game Boy port. And the Famicom port actually came out after the Game Boy version. The goal in Quarth is to complete rectangles, and you'll have these blocks falling from the top of the screen, while your ship at the bottom fires additional blocks up. Now you could just clear out the pieces that are coming toward you by filling them in, but that's not how you earn points or power-ups. Instead, you want to arrange it so that you can eliminate multiple blocks at once. You could have a gap in the middle as long as you have a complete rectangle. That adds a bit of a challenge here because you'll often find situations where completing a larger rectangle requires completing a smaller rectangle. So picking your targets matters a lot. On top of that, when you complete a rectangle, the progress of other blocks stops as it's cleared, so you could use that time to set up your next removal. The Game Boy version has power-ups that you use by hitting the B button. These can freeze the movement or eliminate all the blocks on the screen. If you survive long enough, then you advance a stage and get tougher patterns. I like Quarth a lot, although it seems like quite a few people bounce off of it. I find that the challenge of trying to figure out how to remove a lot of blocks in one go makes Quarth interesting. The original Flappy was a bit of a big deal when it was released on the Famicom in 1984, because it was the biggest by-volume Famicom game to that point. 512 kilobits, 240 levels. The Game Boy game is actually a lot smaller than the Famicom one. At 256 kilobits, they cut the game down to 160 levels, and the levels were divided up for Mode A and Mode B. Mode A was for the challenging, thoughtful puzzles that required some brain power, while Mode B had the action-heavy levels with lots of enemies. Regardless of whether you're playing Mode A or Mode B, your goal is to push the flashing boulder onto the flashing panel. You can always push but not pull the boulders, and the boulders are affected by gravity, falling down when you push them off an edge. You, on the other hand, can freely move around the screen. The boulders can squish enemies that you push them on top of, or you could pick up mushrooms and throw them at enemies to temporarily stun them. Other boulders can be pushed around as well and used to make paths, but you can also break those boulders by walking into them when they're pushed up against something. It's an easy enough set of rules to understand, and they lead to a huge variety of levels. Early on, puzzle games were the big feature of the Game Boy, and Flappy Special's a pretty solid entry into that genre, with a bit of a pedigree. Penguin Coon Wars Versus is another straight port of a Famicom game, which was a port of a pretty obscure arcade game. And here, I think it actually works better on the Game Boy. The principal reason for that is that the game is set up as a series of one-on-one matches with another person, and so playing with two Game Boys across a link cable gives both players a good view of the action. The game is a tournament between animals where they have a table and 5 balls on each side. A timer is counting down 60 seconds, and the goal is to have all 10 balls on your opponent's side. Failing that, you want them to have more balls on their side when time runs out. At the 30-second mark, an obstacle will appear in the middle of the table that will tend to deflect balls in odd directions. If you get hit by a rolling ball, then you get knocked over and stunned for several seconds, which lets your opponent go balls deep. You're stunned for quite a while, too. I noticed in the Game Boy version, it's a lot harder to chain stun somebody, where you hit them with the ball over and over again, preventing them from getting up. However, you also get hit by balls that look like they've flown past you. Until they've settled in the tray, you can't collect them. Penguin Coon Wars Versus is a very simple game, but because it's structured as a multiplayer deathmatch, or maybe ball match in this case, it's got a bit more of a hook than you might think at first glance. Just so it's clear, I'm not playing the US version of Space Invaders here. That version loads up a Super Nintendo port of Space Invaders when you plug it into a Super Game Boy. Now the Famicom port of Space Invaders was a bit of a mess. Taito scaled down the characters, but nothing else. So it wound up looking pretty ugly and not playing very nice. They had to scale down the invaders for the Game Boy screen as well, but here they learned their lesson and didn't try to fit an arcade quantity of invaders on the screen. And the result is a version of Space Invaders that plays pretty well. Of course, Space Invaders is one of the most basic arcade games out there, since it is one of the foundational games and was 12 years old at the time that this Game Boy version was released. And to put that time scale and technology jump into perspective, the moon landing was 9 years before Space Invaders was released. So while the Game Boy might not have been a powerful machine, it was still stronger than the hardware used to play the arcade game. I think it demonstrates that Taito learned their lessons from the Famicom game, and had a better grasp on how to port their games to systems. And as a Game Boy game, it's fine. It's another quick-playing game, so it's good for those short sessions that they anticipated the Game Boy's main use case would be. I might have liked a few additional features. After all, they hid Space Invaders Part 2 on the Famicom cart. But if you wanted to play Space Invaders on the go, this wasn't a bad option. I love Quix. It might be my favorite arcade game. And the Game Boy port is a weird situation, since it's published by Nintendo instead of Taito. And it seems like Nintendo commissioned this one from a contract developer themselves, since it was made by Minakuchi Engineering, the same as Solar Striker. The goal in Quix is to enclose the quix, the abstract lines that bounce around the screen. If you hold down B, you can break off of the border and slowly draw a line, while A lets you draw quickly. You get points when you enclose an area, and the quix can no longer enter that space. If the quix comes in contact with you while you're drawing, or comes in contact with the line that you're drawing, then you lose a life. There's also sparks that roam the solid borders, and if they catch you, you'll also lose a life. Your goal is to reduce the area that the quix can move around in to the percentage given at the top of the screen. But doing more than that will get you a lot of bonus points. On the Game Boy, Quix is slower and has a much lower resolution, but I think the gameplay comes through mostly intact. And Nintendo even added Mario to the game for some reason. He appears in cutscenes after some levels. My biggest problem here is that even though I'm a bit out of practice, I can play Quix for a long time. So for me at least, this isn't a game I could play in a quick session. I'm glad Batman slipped in under the year mark, because it's a good example of a pattern that reoccurs a lot through the Game Boy's lifetime. A game company gets the license to make a big game based on a hot property. They make their game for a big console, and then they turn out something lesser using that same license for the Game Boy. Which isn't a knock on the Game Boy's Batman. It is the best action game on the Game Boy to this point, but it lives in the shadow of one of the best Famicom games, and it doesn't exactly reflect the license well. The key here is that Batman on the Game Boy is a run-and-gun. Emphasis on the gun. For a character who kind of explicitly doesn't use guns, so that when people post comments about, oh yes he does, they have to cherry pick from the same roughly dozen exceptions across the character's 80 years of history. Divorced from the Batman license, this is a pretty good action game, and a lot of that is due to the scale that Sunsoft chose here. Batman and his foes are puny, but that means there's more things on the screen, and you get a better view of what's coming up. You get a variety of guns and can power them up, and the platforming is challenging but not absurd. This is a short game with only 5 platforming levels, plus an additional shoot-'em-up stage. And that's an appropriate length for a Game Boy action title. Though a password system would have been nice so people could put the game down. Batman might look a bit rough, but it plays well, and that's what counts. I don't have a clue how Tonkin House became so obsessed with Bloodia. It was originally a puzzle game on computers in the early 80s. Though such a minor release, hardly anybody remembers it exists. And for some reason in 1990, Tonkin House decided to go on a Bloodia spree. There's the Game Boy game, of course, and the Famicom version that you're also seeing, and a PC Engine version that for some reason was the only one of these to get released outside of Japan. And as far as I can tell, none of these versions were successes. The concept of Bloodia is that there's a marble on a track, and as it rolls along that track, every time it completes a section of track, that piece of track vanishes. Your goal is to clear all the track on the stage. And to do that, there's a hole in the tiles, and clicking on a tile neighboring the hole will slide it into that hole. So Bloodia is really just a dressed-up sliding block puzzle that happens to have a timer. You can even slide those pieces when they have the ball on them, and that's a key to being able to complete some of the levels. The Famicom version added a Mario 3 style overworld, but for the Game Boy version you get to choose what style of puzzle you want. Now I like puzzle games, but I've never been able to get into Bloodia. The challenge is the same as any sliding block puzzle. You have to undo your work in order to move something else into place. And that's actually kind of an unsatisfying feeling. You want to be building a solution, not undoing a solution. It always came across to me like Bloodia was missing some essential spark that would turn it into a good puzzle game. And here we are at the 365th day of the Game Boy's life with one last game to talk about. The last Game Boy game for me is Super Chinese Land. And this one is nearly a direct port of Super Chinese. Super Chinese was initially an arcade game, but it found success on the Famicom due to being a co-op game at the height of the Famicom boom. It was also a pretty bad game, and Super Chinese Land doesn't do anything to improve it. In fact, I think it makes it worse. It's played from an overhead view, while the B button does a flip kick. Your goal on every stage is to defeat a certain number of enemies, which will make the exit open up. You can also punch the bricks around the stage to reveal power-ups and other items. One of the big challenges in the game is that as you progress, some enemies become immune to certain attacks. And so you'll have to find the correct power-up or item in order to defeat them. The big problem with Super Chinese Land, the thing that makes it nearly unplayable, is that rather than scale down their single-screen arcade game to make it fit on the Game Boy's screen, they just made it scroll. So now you have a tiny viewpoint into the world. The only way you know you've beaten a level is if you can hear the alarm, and that's going to be an issue if you're trying to play quietly in bed. The tiny viewport also will let enemies just get on top of you. You die in one hit in Super Chinese Land, so taking away the player's situational awareness is even worse than it usually is. And there isn't even a link cable co-op mode for this one to bring back the feature that people liked in the original. All in all, Super Chinese Land is a poor copy of a game that wasn't any good to begin with. And so our tour of the first year of the Game Boy comes to an end. And I think it was a good sample of what will dominate the first half of the Game Boy's life. At least until a certain game comes along during its waning days, and everyone rushes back to the Game Boy to try to cash in on it. The Game Boy had a much quicker evolution than the Famicom. While the first 6 months were fairly similar, with Nintendo offering the baseline Game Boy experience, by the end of this first year, all of the major Japanese publishers seemed to be on board with it. That first year of the Game Boy had 51 releases, and about 60% of those were crammed into the second half of that year. People weren't ready for it when it was released, but they were on board really fast. And as the Famicom's market dominance starts to wane after 1990, the Game Boy winds up carrying that 8-bit gaming torch on into the 2000s. The Famicom and the Game Boy ran in parallel for quite a while. In fact, just 1 week before the very last game to ship on the Famicom was released, Nintendo had one of their own releases on the Game Boy, Donkey Kong. In the very final days of the Famicom's existence, they truly passed the torch over. I don't see myself revisiting the Game Boy as Famidaily continues. There's still a year and a half of episodes to do there. But it's a platform I've come to appreciate a lot more by digging deep into its library. The Super Famicom might have been the follow-up, but the Game Boy feels like the real successor to the Famicom's legacy.